Hi, I'm Gail Hopley, and I've had the honor of living with Steve Hopley for 40 bunches of years.
40 some odd.
47-ish, 48-ish years. So I thought I would be appropriate to introduce him and our guest presenter, or our second presenter, I should say, Carson Curley. And I'll start with Carson. He is from Virginia. He grew up on Norfolk, Virginia, along the Chesapeake Bay. So he's swapped bays, but he's an old hand at this, right? And he came to the West in 2020, a very auspicious time to move around the country, and began working for REI in Bellingham, he and his significant other, Harley. And they live up near us on the corner of Wharf Street and Samish Island Road. So, but Carson now works for Bill Dewey, and he is, as Bill says, an expert in weather stuff. So he's the guy that I assume says, we should go today or we shouldn't go today, right?
I wish.
Or tells them what they're in for when they go that day out on the flats to work in the oysters, clams, and everything else, and geoducks. So anyway, so it'll be fun. So the two of them are going to present tonight about the tides. And I don't know if you were here 2 years ago, Steve did a similar presentation on the dikes. And he does like to get into the nitty-gritty details, as you may remember. So you are now going to get not the PhD, but at least a graduate class in
undergraduate
class in tides, which turns out is quite a science, and I don't think anybody knows all of it yet. But it's an interesting world. So since it affects us a lot, we're glad to see so many people show up here tonight, and they're still coming in. Hi, Bill. That's Steve's brother.
Oh, good. He probably wants to know where his tide book is.
There's a room right up front, Bill. Bill, do you want to sit in front with me? Okay. So anyway, I would like you to welcome Carson and Steve and enjoy all you're going to learn. There's some snacks in the back if you start to get fatigued, and lots of water.
All right, let's get moving. Well, first off, thank you everybody for showing up. I hope it's turns out to be worth your while. When I had the notion of putting together a presentation like this, I think Gail and I talked about it, and I said, maybe we could just do it in the living room, because probably only going to be a half a dozen people going to want to show up. But then we decided, well, let's see if the community center is available. So it's a good thing that we did that. And I want to thank Carson also. Bill is real involved with the Resilient Access Committee and trying to make these wild-ass guesses on what the tides are actually going to do. And Carson works with him on that endeavor. Bill wasn't available, but Carson was, so he can speak with some authority about some of these tools that we use to try to figure out what the tides are actually going to be. The had, I guess, three reasons for wanting to put this together. One, it's interesting, and we all live near the water, and we all should have a good understanding about the tides and what makes the tides. In my opinion, we should all have a little bit of a understanding of that. And when we come out of here, you're going to have a lot better, I suspect, understanding. The other thing is, I really wanted to get us all on the same sheet of music. We reference some certain tides and Chuckanut Bay tides or Port Townsend tides. And sometimes you'll see folks coming on and they're obviously using different tide stations or whatever and talking about some different numbers, and it can be a little bit confusing. It is to me, So trying to, like I say, get us all on the same sheet of music. And then the last thing is to show you, actually demonstrate some of these tools that we use to make these predictions about what the water level is actually going to be for a given tide. So we're going to talk about the astronomical tide, harmonic constituents, and harmonic constants, reference versus subordinate tide station, tide prediction tools, the apps, tide books, calendars, and what NOAA offers. A little discussion of what causes storm surge, review of some of the recent flood events that we had here on the island. Talk about how we determine what the actual water level is. We'll take a look at the tides that are in store for us this winter, and then we'll play around with these tools a little bit in real time to see what we're faced with in terms of actual tides or storm surge. Okay, astronomical tide. I'll just read this. The alternating rise and fall of sea level with respect to land produced by the gravitational attraction of the moon and the sun. You know, we all kind of intuitively, we know that's what's causing the tide, but that term astronomical tide, when I first heard that, I go, yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, that one on December 27th, that was pretty astronomical. But that is the term for the rise and fall of sea level due to the gravitational attraction of the sun and the moon. This is just kind of another drawing of that picture you had right there, and it shows some of the variation. These different motions of the moon and the sun, they're cyclical. They have a very well-defined period or frequency, and you can see and there's a number of these different motions. There's nearly 400 different motions or changes in position of the moon and the sun that can affect the water levels. And a couple of them on here, you can see the orbits of the Earth around the sun and of the moon around the Earth. The orbits are elliptical, so sometimes the moon and the Earth are closer together, and sometimes they're further apart. And the moon and the Earth and the sun closer and further apart. And the gravity, the force of gravity between those celestial bodies varies with the distance between the bodies. And of course, the Earth is rotating around once every 24 hours. So, and there's a ton of other motions, like I say, up to 400 different changes in position that affect the tides. So here's a great little graph, and this is one of the ones that a little understood or not well known reason for the tides, and that is that you think of the moon rotating around the Earth, but in actuality, the moon and the Earth rotate around or orbit around each other, and they orbit around the barycenter, which is right there at G. That is the center of mass between the moon and the Earth, and the Earth rotates. The moon, you can see, rotates around that barycenter, but the Earth also orbits around that barycenter. There's the center of mass of the Earth right there at C, and there's the barycenter, the center of mass of the moon and the Earth. And the Earth, you can at this position on the Earth, you see it's rotating around a curve right there. Does that make sense? Yeah. So the effect of that is there's two forces at work. There's the gravitational attraction of the moon, But in a lot of these places we'll call it a centrifugal force. Centrifugal force that acts on the water. This is because the Earth is rotating or orbiting, if you will, around that center of mass. And it's actually the inertia of the water, of the seas. They have a certain inertia. A body in motion wants to stay in motion. But the Earth is curving around. The water wants to keep going the way it was. So that creates this, some is referred to this fake force, this centrifugal force that you feel like when a car goes around a corner, it feels like you're being pushed out. Well, that's what's happening to the water on the Earth, opposite the moon. So you have the moon on this side, and the gravitational attraction of the moon is pulling water toward the moon. But the inertia of the water, as it orbits around the barycenter, is pushing the water away from the moon. And note on here, Earth's gravity, 10 million times stronger than the moon's gravity. The moon and this corresponding inertia, the other direction, can't begin to raise the water against the force of gravity. The moon's gravity does not raise the water. The Earth's gravity is just too strong, or if it does, it's minuscule. But what it can do is pull water out of this region. It can move it horizontally to the force of gravity of the Earth. Does that make sense? The Earth's pulling it down, and it can't lift against that, but it can move it perpendicular to the Earth's gravity. So it pulls water, this tractive force, they call it, pulls water, and this is the maximum tractive force right in here. It pulls water to this region directly under the moon. And the inertia of the water as it's orbiting around the barycenter pushes water to the opposite side of the moon. And I'll say something about questions. I'm trying to go through this, and you try to get your head around it. It's tough. If anybody has a question about the explanation, it needs to be more clear. We need, we'll field those questions as we go. If something occurs to you that sort of beyond what the explanation, we'll save those questions for the end. Okay? All right. So here's a diagram of what they call these bulges. Here's the moon. It's on the opposite side this time. There's the Earth. And here's these two bulges that are created by the gravitational attraction of the moon on this side, directly under the moon, and the inertia or centrifugal force of the water wanting to keep going on the other side. So you get these two, and these forces are in balance right at the center mass of the Earth. They're in balance. Almost by definition, that's why we're in orbit. The desire to keep going straight and the pull in are in balance, so we end up orbiting. So we're orbiting around the barycenter because these forces here are in balance. But on this side, the gravity's stronger. This little arrow represents the inertia. This is the Earth's gravity. And the net force on this side is that little double arrow. Over here, this thin arrow is the inertia. There's the gravity. It's further away. Gravity varies with the force inverse cube, I think, of the distance. So on this side of the Earth, further from the moon, the force of gravity of the moon is less. Inertia's the same. So the net force the other way, away from the moon, is the same as it is over here. There's the net force. And it creates these two bulges. Attractive forces are pulling the water from this here and toward the gravity of the moon, they're pulling the water this way because of the inertia, the attractive forces, and building up these two bulges or humps. And then the Earth is rotating under those bulges. That's really key. I mean, that's what it's all about. The Earth rotates one time around in 24 hours. So a point on the Earth travels through this bulge, and that's high. That's a bulge in the water. The water is higher there. And then 12 hours later, more or less, it rotates through this bulge. That's why we get. Go ahead.
Okay, so the thing that kind of surprised me, that maybe it makes sense, is or must make sense, is that there's more gravity from the Earth on one side of the Earth than on the other side of the Earth.
No.
Oh, good. I thought you said that at the weekend.
No. Of the moon.
Yes.
Yes, because the one side is closer to the moon
Got it. Yeah.
and the other side's further away. So the force of gravity of the moon on one side is stronger than it is on the other.
But somehow it comes out equal.
Well,
Doesn't really.
the net force comes out equal. The centrifugal force is greater, but it's reduced a little bit, you could say, by the gravitational force of the moon. So the net force is double there. Over here, more gravity, you still have this inertia, and the net force is this. So they end up being the same. So you get, essentially, we'll say, two equal bulges. And the same thing happens with the sun. The sun is doing the same thing. There's two bulges due to the sun. The gravitational force of the sun and the inertia of the water on the sort of the outside of the orbit around the sun. So so you have those two bulges. The moon's bulges or force about 2.5 times the sun's. The sun is a lot bigger and whatever, but it's a lot further away. So the bulges due to the sun are smaller than the attractive forces and all that. With the sun are less. The period I mentioned, the cycle, the periodic nature, the harmonic nature of all these different, almost 400 different forces. Well, on this one, the periods, even see if I can get this right so it's understandable. The period of the rotate, it's 24 hours to rotate. The Earth rotates completely, makes one rotation, one revolution in 24 hours. So every 12 hours, it's either under the sun or it's directly opposite the sun. So every 12 hours, it's in the sun's bulge, and 12 hours later, it's in the other one, the inertia, because of the orbit bulge. What's that? We're talking about the Earth and its rotation, 24 hours. Every 12 hours, the sun is either directly overhead or directly opposite. It's every 12 hours. The moon's a little bit different because the moon is rotating around the Earth the same way we're rotating, west to east, right? The moon's also going that way, and it's 1 month orbit around the Earth. And what happens is the Earth goes around one time, but the moon has advanced a little bit in its orbit. So it actually, instead of being the moon directly overhead 24 hours later, it's 24 hours and 52 minutes later. So the Earth rotates through the bulges created by the moon's gravity and the inertia every 12 hours and 26 minutes. which leads us to the next. You with me?
Yeah.
Oh, totally.
Totally. Okay, this is one of the fun ones. Spring and neap tides. When the sun and the moon and their bulges are in phase, and that they're in phase during the full moon and the new moon. The moon's directly overhead, and over here. The moon's directly overhead, and the sun is directly overhead. So the moon's bulge and the sun's bulge reinforce each other. You get double whammy. The moon's bulge, or the sun's bulge, and then 2.5 times that much of moon bulge. And you add those two together, and you get some really big bulges. You get some big tides. Those are the spring tides. And the same thing happens over here. For the full moon, it's directly opposite the sun, but its bulges over here, and the sun's inertia bulges over here, and then the sun's gravitational bulges over here, and the moon's inertial bulges over here, and they add up, so you get big tides again. So roughly 12 hours apart. But because the phase of the moon, the frequency is 12 hours and 26 minutes, it keeps getting a little bit ahead and it moves around. And in this position here, where these are the first quarter and the third quarter, the moon's bulge is over here, the sun's bulge is over here. They're 180 degrees out of phase. So the sun is pulling water away from the moon's bulge, if you will, and it makes this tide less. And it makes the low tides less too. You have less tidal range during the first quarter and the third quarter. So if you've looked at the tide book, and I know you all have, you'll get a run of really high tides, extreme tides, and extreme lows. And then a week later, the tides won't be as extreme. And then a week after that, they're more extreme again. That's as the moon and the sun either get lined up or at 90-degree angles with each other. And this is going on with all these different, nearly 400 components or different movements or orientations of the sun and in the moon. They have a phase. You understand the concept. I mean, you have a phases when they're at their strongest and when they're at their lowest attraction. So they're pulling the water up and then it's going down, each one of these things. So when all those things get in phase, you get really high tides. And if there happen to be all of them out of phase, they can, you'll have something intermediate. And so what they call this, where you have 2 tides a day, which is what we have most of the time around here, that's the semi-diurnal tide. 2 tides in 24 hours, semi-diurnal. There are forces also that are diurnal. They're twice a day. We'll get into that a little bit more. So there's diurnal and there's semi-diurnal. For the most part, we have semi-diurnal, 2 tides per day, roughly 12 hours apart. But sometimes, especially recently, we've had only 1 tide a day. And that's because some of the diurnal constituents, the ones that only happen once a day, dominate. They're more important, and they can actually cause 1 tide a day. And you'll also see most of the time we have tidal inequality up here at these latitudes. You'll have one of the high tides will be bit higher than the other. And that has to do with the influence of the diurnal or once a day components of the tide. Okay? So we're going through this pretty quickly. This is good. All right. Any questions? Anything not clear or clear enough?
Question back here.
Yes.
When it says spring tide, is that referring to a season?
No. Let's go back. Don't go back? Real quickly. Spring tide, it's not a season. It's not a season. Spring tides are the term for these higher tides that happen every 2 weeks. Every 2 weeks you'll have spring tide, when new moon and full moon, when these bulges line up and add to each other. Neap tides when they're at 90 degrees to each other, so they're not adding up, they're actually reducing one another a little bit.
And why in all this do the very low tides happen in the nighttime during the winter?
Oh.
Those some questions, Steve, so we can move on maybe?
Yeah.
That's a later question.
Yeah,
We'll get it.
I don't think I know the answer to that.
Huh?
Okay, that's a good question. All right, this is getting into tide prediction. I'm just going to read this. The equilibrium tide is an idealized model of tides that assumes a frictionless, landless Earth covered by a uniform ocean about 4,000 feet deep, roughly, but the same all over. In this model, the combined gravitational and inertial forces create two tidal bulges on opposite sides of the Earth, resulting in 2 high tides and 2 low tides. Which is what we've been talking. This is what we've been talking about. Exactly. So this is kind of a very idealized state. And if it was actually this perfect, frictionless is a big part of it. If those bulges responded instantaneously to having the moon directly overhead, that bulge of water formed right then. Or when the sun's directly overhead, I mean, that bulge would be directly under the sun. That's not reality at all. So you could predict tides mathematically in this equilibrium tide situation. All the periods are known, and that would be a good thing. But we know that the ocean is not frictionless. The response is not instantaneous. It's not. There are land masses, and those land masses have huge impacts on the actual water level of the tides. They amplify them, really. Without those land masses, the tides would not amount to but I guess a meter or so. But with the land masses, they amplify these tides, and you get these really huge tide swings. So I talked about all these different motions, 400 or so different motions of the Earth, different orientations of the Earth and the Sun that influence the tide. Each one of those is considered what they call a harmonic constituent. That's the term for these different orientations, harmonic constituents. They go through they have a regular frequency. They can be described with a sine curve. It goes through a maximum, minimum on a very regular basis. And in the equilibrium tide, you could figure out what all those are. But in reality, the influence of those harmonic constituents varies in every location on the Earth, and it has to do with the hydrology of the location, the depth, the exposure to the open ocean, the width of the ocean, everything. All these things affect both the amplitude of the different harmonic of the different constituents, and they affect the phase. The phase being how much delay. I said if it was instantaneous, that's the equilibrium tide. If it was instantaneous, you could calculate all this stuff, but it's not. It lags behind. The maximum amplitude of every one of these constituents is a function of the when that happens relative to the theoretical time it should happen in the equilibrium tide varies with every location. So you have to actually observe the tides. You have to observe the tides, get a very accurate tide recording, tide gauge of some kind, and observe the tides in any location that you want to be able to predict the tides for, basically. So that you can, and when you've done that, there's some sort of incredible mathematical modeling that the computers can do, and they can take that curve that gets generated of the actual tides for a minimum of 30 days. Really, it takes a year to get a really good predictions to, and ideally, I mean, perfect, it has to go for 18.6 years. 18.6 years to of data to observe, get a tide curve for a given location from which you can extract the amplitude and the phase lag, they call it, because it's how much it's behind what it would be in the equilibrium tide. It gets delayed. So you need to know those things in order to generate a tide prediction curve. And this is kind of an example. This is from San Diego, how this kind of works. And it's a little misleading because if you read this, it sounds like they look at it for 48 hours and they can actually derive these curves. And that's not the case. You have to, like I say, you have to observe these tides for at least a month, better as a year, to see all of them. All in 18.6 years to see absolutely all of them. But when you've done that and you put it through this analysis, you can actually draw a cosine curve for every one of the hydraulic constituents. You can noodle these out. That's what these are up here. So there was an observed tide, a long period of observed tides, and they were able to crank out the amplitude and phase of these particular harmonic constituents. And the amplitude and phase, those are called harmonic constants that go into a formula so that you can figure out what the tide's going to be at any point in time. So you can kind of look, though, how it works. They've just taken a 24-hour sample of these different cosine curves. And the top ones up here, these are the semi-diurnal constituents. They're twice a day. This is 2 days across here, so there's 4 of them. This is the M2. This is the principal. This is the semi-diurnal effect of the moon. This is the semi-diurnal effect of the sun. And then you have the N2, I actually don't know, but the 2 means it's semi-diurnal. This is the K2, which is also has almost no adding or subtracting to it. And then these are some of the diurnal ones, and they pulled out a few of those. And you can kind of see how then how you can predict the tide. You can see this one here's up, but that one's down, that's nothing, up, down, down, down. And it predicts a tide of about that high. So the M2 is really strong there, but all the rest of these are out of phase with the M2 at this time, and there's a small tide predicted. And then you go here, well, there's the M2 again, way up there, then, well, that one's down, that's down, but that's up. That one's kind of intermediate or whatever, and you find, wow, the predicted tide, the sum of all these is pretty high. So So you go, that's basically how this process works. So here is the summing. This curve down here is the summing of all these curves, if you will. And down here is the actual tide curve that happened during that time. Matches up pretty well. So they generated these harmonic constants. They're able to take them and put together a predicted tide curve. And then they found that matched up pretty well with the tides in predicting the tides. So that's what you have to do to predict tides. You have to come up with these, for any specific location, you have to come up with these harmonic constants. The phase or phase lag and the amplitude of all these harmonic constituents. Okay?
So Steve, one question about that.
Yeah.
Take you 18.6 years to factor out any mitigating forces such as wind, barometric pressure?
That's not why it takes 18.6 years, but those things do average out over the course of 18. I mean, sometimes, you have a higher tide because of some factors we'll talk about, sometimes lower, but over a longer period of time, those things average out. But that's not why they need 18.6 years. They need 18.6 years because the frequency of the longest constituent is 18.6 years. So to see the effect of that constituent, you've got to observe the tides for that long. Another reason why you have to see, so that's one, to see the effect of all the different constituents takes that long.
Which constituent is the 18?
Well, it is the regression of the lunar nodes. Yeah. So you don't need to know that, but that's an 18.6 year, and it affects the declination of the moon. The moon is not exactly run parallel to the sun, the plane of the sun's orbit. It's a little bit off, 5 degrees off, but it goes back and forth. Sometimes it adds to 23.5, sometimes it subtracts from 23.5, and the period of that, the regression of the lunar node is 18.6 years. And interestingly enough, are there any druids in here? No. Okay. If there were, they would be able to tell you that we just went through the maximum, the 28.5 degree major. Help me out here. Major lunar standstill. If you heard, that's the 28.5. We just had that. Okay. This last year, and they had celebrations and druids and all that stuff. Okay. Oh, back up. Reference versus subordinate tide stations. All right, this is a NOAA. This is a little NOAA map. It's got these dots. These are all tide stations around here. The white ones, let's start there. The dark ones are called reference stations or harmonic stations. These are tide stations where they have observed actual tides. They have a tide station there, a recordings tide station, and they have observed the tides in these locations long enough to actually develop the harmonic constants for those stations. They know the phase and the amplitude of the 37. I said there were up to 400 motions. There's 37 that the most influential orientation, changes in orientation affecting the tides. There's 37 of the ones that they really want to take into account in order to project the tides. So they've measured the actual tides over, in the case of this one right here I'm pointing to, that's Port Townsend, for a long time, way longer than 18.6 years. So they are able to generate these harmonic constants for that area, and they can use those in a formula to sum up the effect, and they can predict the tides way out into the future because they know the harmonic constants. These white ones on here, these are subordinate stations. They haven't done that kind of measuring at these stations. And I've got Bellingham up here highlighted. That's this one right here. But there's a lot of other ones. And there used to be one right here in Chuckanut Bay on this chart. There would have been one of these white pins there. And what a subordinate station is, they haven't observed the tides for a long enough period, no 18.6 years or anything like that, but they observed them enough to tell how that tide in that location corresponds to a tide at a reference or a harmonic station where they have cranked out all those numbers. And interestingly, and this is the reason why you'll hear us talk about Chuckanut Bay and Port Townsend. Chuckanut Bay, when it used to be on here, it's not on here anymore. 2-3 years ago, it was on here. Chuckanut Bay was on here. It was one of the subordinate stations that NOAA had, and they had a tide chart for Chuckanut Bay. They don't have it anymore, and I actually contacted them. I said, hey, we use Chuckanut Bay. That's the closest one to us. That's the one we want. Where to go? The guy said, well, it's all based on observation, how the tides vary, relative to the reference station. The reference station is Port Townsend. Well, we made those observations so long ago, and for such a short period, we don't really support them anymore. We don't have a high enough level of confidence in those corrections to actually give you Chuckanut Bay anymore. Okay, so he says, use Bellingham Bay, it's close enough. I said, well, it's not close enough for us, but that's the way it goes. If you look at these, and I've gone in and looked at a lot of them, these other subordinate stations around here, they're all subordinate stations to Port Townsend. They all use Port Townsend corrected. And they actually have charts. They'll have charts to show you, and I'll show you one here in a second, to show you the tides. But those are all produced by applying these corrections to the Port Townsend tide. They're not based on the harmonic constants because they don't know them, because they haven't developed them for those stations. But they're based on Port Townsend. And most all of these stations that I went and clicked on, they were all referencing Port Townsend. Port Townsend. So if you go on to NOAA, they actually show the harmonic constants. On one of the things they offer on these harmonic stations is they will give you the numbers for these 37 harmonic constituents that they've calculated or determined the harmonic constants for. And these are the major ones up here. These are the ones actually that we saw in those graphs from San Diego where they kind of demonstrate how they add these things up. But so we highlighted those. And it's a little bit, can you see that well enough? No. Okay, so we don't need to delve into that, but too much. But it lists the name, the M2, the S2. That's I mentioned before. That's the lunar semi-diurnal and the solar semi-diurnal, and this one down here is the lunar diurnal, and there's another lunar diurnal. And here is there's the phase lag, how much it lags behind the equilibrium tide, the idealized tide. And there's the speed in degrees per hour. And I just put on here that this is the amplitude phase based on this NOAA's. This is an interesting point, and we'll talk about it a little bit more later, but we're 45 minutes into this. I think we're doing okay. The tidal epoch that they're using right now is this period 1983 to 2001. So they did those observations for that 1983 to 2001. They generated from that, which they probably didn't change any. They're probably, these harmonic constants were the same for this period as they were in previous ones. The phase and the amplitude and the phase lag and all that. But the other thing that they do is the tidal datum. In our case, for our tides, it's mean lower low water. The actual level of mean lower low water, it's a specific height below their benchmark, is from the period 1983 to 2001. And that can be important to us in our tide predictions and our storm surge prediction, because the sea level has probably gone up since 1983 and 2001. Okay, some of these tools. This one, Tide Book, Bill's Tide Book that he came here looking for. Yeah, you were looking for it today and you wonder where the heck it was. Yep, I know it. I didn't know you were going to be here. And I went in and stole it. Anyway, if you look down here, so this is Port Town. This is how these tide books work. They only have some of the harmonic stations. This is what the old timers, what we always used to use. You have, these are the port towns and tides, our harmonic station. And these are the corrections. This is, you add 33 minutes to the high and you add 53 minutes to the low, and you don't have to add anything to the feet of the high. Our tides here are, if it's a 9'5" tide above mean lower low water in Port Townsend, it's a 9'5" tide above mean lower low water here, theoretically. That's not always going to hold, but it's pretty close. Here's this one. This is the NOAA's tide prediction graph, if you will, for Bellingham. And you can see up here where it says reference station Port Townsend. It's a subordinate station. Bellingham is reference station Port Townsend. So they generate this curve, but it's based on applying these corrections, 43 minutes and 71 minutes, and multiply the heights by 0.9 for the high and 0.94 for the low. That's how they generate. But instead of having to do all the math, you can just go, if you want Bellingham, you go on there and they've done it for you, and they've produced these curves. This is just scanned my Tide app. At least this one, Tides, for now anyway, until they decide, well, if NOAA's not going to support it, we're not going to do it either. But it does give Chuckanuck Bay. So it actually produces, and this is the one that I use. So this has applied those corrections, 33 was it, and 53 or whatever it was from that tide book you saw. They've applied it and they've created these curves. And this is actually the curve, the predicted tide for the 7th of November, when we're going to have a 9'5" tide at 7:01 in the morning. And here's the sort of the fourth one. Ta-da! This is when I put in the plug. The tide calendar, which are for sale back in the back. This is this year's with the mermaid on it. So that, again, these are Port Townsend tides, because they don't produce one of these graphs for all these subordinate stations. They don't do them for all the harmonic stations either, but they do, these tide calendar producers do give one with Port Townsend tides. And if you go up here and look at these corrections, 30 minutes and 45, that's Ruth and I saying, well, okay, Chuckanuck Bay was 33 minutes after Port Townsend, and another one on the other side of us, about the same distance from us as Chuckanuck Bay, was something less than 30 minutes correction. So let's split the difference. So for our tide calendar for Samish Bay, we're going to say that the correction is 30 minutes and 45 minutes, and you don't have to make any correction for the heights. So those are some of the prediction tools. Okay? All right. Barometric pressure, wind, storm surge causes. Storm surge are differences in the actual water level, which are caused by meteorological constituents. We have those celestial constituents that we analyze to make the projections, but there's what I've seen them referred to as meteorological constituents that actually affect the level of the water. One of them that we look at very closely and everybody's aware of is barometric pressure. As the barometric pressure goes down, the tides go up, and it's partially just a direct result. Pressure goes down, there's less weight, the water actually rises. But that's really not a very significant, although a 1 inch drop, 1 inches of mercury drop in barometric pressure theoretically can actually cause the tide to be about a foot or 13 inches higher, something like that. But it's probably, when we're watching this barometric pressure, it's associated with these other factors that happen. You get a low barometer like that, a lot of times you get a lot of wind too. Because wind, you want to talk about wind?
Yeah.
I can.
Okay. I'll have a drink of water.
All right. So there's a few different forms of wind that are affecting our tides. The most easiest to understand is just a local wind. So we have a west-northwest wind blowing in from the sound, pushing water into Samish Bay. And that's going to cause an immediate rise in that tide. But beyond that, we also have wind that's more coastal and further away from us that's also going to be causing some tidal changes. The biggest one of these is, again, west-northwest winds that is actually blowing water into the Strait of Juan de Fuca and pushing a mass of water from the ocean into the Sound. And that's going to affect tides up and down throughout the Sound, which is probably the biggest factor that we're looking for when we're looking at these king tides. Is that going to be pushing water in towards us at the same time that we're already expecting to have these major tides? And finally, we have remote sea level anomalies. The one that you guys probably are most familiar with is like bomb cyclones that are occurring off the coast. That can cause bomb cyclones off the coast. Those can cause an effect called the Ekman transport effect. And so actually what is happening is within the bomb cyclones, we're seeing wind from the south to the north. And even though the wind is pushing that way, this Ekman transport effect is actually causing water from the storm to pile up against the coast and again within the Sound. So those are really the three main things that we're looking at when it comes to wind. Beyond that, we can also look at swell and waves that are being pushed in, specifically more local, because when we see those waves, those can again raise the water level above what we prepared for.
That was a very good summary. And just one thing about remote sea level anomalies. Barometric pressure, we have tools we can look out. They're predictable. Wind, we're going to demonstrate some wind tools or whatever. We really don't have a tool to predict remote sea level anomalies. It's almost like if you get a lot of tide surge and you can't explain it because of the barometric pressure or the wind, then the rest of it was the remote sea level anomaly. Okay. But if anybody wants to read a little bit more, I've got a couple of articles here. One's by Eric Grossman, who's a professor up at Western. modeling extreme water levels in the Salish Sea, the importance of including remote sea level anomalies. This is fascinating. And then there's this other one by another group of authors that talk mostly about wind, but also about remote sea level anomalies. So those are some of the things, principal things that can affect the actual water levels. I'm going to look at a couple of things here. You've seen these before, but here is, and this is something that you can get on NOAA for some of the harmonic stations where they have really good tide measuring instrumentations. They provide an actual, virtually in real time, I guess.
Yes.
In real time, they'll give you the actual tide level and the predicted tide level for Port Townsend, our reference station. But you can go back and look at the historical record, which is what this is. This is the December 27th. We all remember that. December 27th,
2022?
19, which year? 2022. December 27th, 2022. This was the big one that just damaged the dike and flooded the road and flooded Blue Heron. We had a predicted tide of 9.8 here. So if you look at the Chuckana Bay one, I think it says on the Tides app it was 9.7, but the actual tide 12.06, and this is the verified actual tide at in Port Townsend. And this, interestingly, if you go into the Port Townsend tides, you'll find they actually have a place on there you can see the highest observed tide. This is the highest tide that they've ever observed at Port Townsend. And it turns out this is it. This is the highest observed tide they've ever observed at Port Townsend. And so this is a shot from the Bellingham Airport, the weather records from Bellingham Airport on the 27th of December 2022. That tide was right around, the tide here was right around 9 o'clock. You come over here, should be on here, where is it? 28.7. 28.7 inches of mercury that day. That is a low barometer. And I think some people here on the island got some readings even lower than that here. But at Bellingham Airport, 28.7 inches. They had not really super strong southeast winds that day, only 15 miles an hour. We were probably pretty lucky that it wasn't a lot windier, or there would have been a lot more damage to that dike and the tide probably would have been higher. And who knows what the remote sea level anomaly was that day. It's probably really something. But just one thing I wanted to point out here, I think we've got the time. The actual tide level, 12.06 feet, when you see these actuals, this is 12.06 feet above the level of mean lower low water during the period 1983 to 2001, the last tidal epoch, where they established what that mean was. So 12.06 feet above that. But the tide here, and they show it here at 9.88 feet, as being, 9.88 feet above mean lower low water during that tidal epoch. That's not really the case. That's 9.88 feet above what mean lower low water is now, if you could say that. If there's sea level rise, the tide is, that has caused mean lower low water to actually go up, then this tide is not, this is 9.88 feet above that mean lower low water, which is probably, more than 9.88 feet. If there's been sea level rise, 9.88 feet above it's actually this tide is not necessarily 9.88. The predicted tide is not necessarily 9.88 feet above that mean low or low water in that tidal epoch. It's probably more than 9.88 feet above that, the predicted tide, because we think sea level's gone up. I don't think that was clear at all, so don't worry about it.
It's gonna be higher.
Yeah, I mean, it's just the effect of sea level, a 9.88 tide, the actual water level, as sea levels go up, the actual water level on a 9.88 tide is higher by the amount the sea level's gone up. And then, so it isn't storm surge that causes that, it's that difference, it's just that sea level's gone up. Here's January 7th. January 7th, we had flooding here. That was, I think, Chuckanut Bay, that was actually a 9'6" tide, Chuckanut Bay, but the verified actual water level was 11.44, almost 11.5 feet. And the reason this is kind of important is we need to know a couple of things. One, we need to know what this combination of barometric pressure and why we watch these actuals, combination of barometric pressure and wind and all that, how much that actually does add to the tides. So we look at these actuals. Okay, here we had this combination of pressure and wind and all that, and it added, in this case, 1.7 feet, right, to the tide. But the other thing we need to know is, what does it take to actually cause flooding? Well, back then on January 7th, 2022, it took about an 11'4" tide to cause flooding. Blue Heron Road was flooding, and there was some water flooding over onto Samish Island Road coming on the island. It was coming over the dike in some of those low spots. But we've done so much sandbagging here and raised up we don't know actually what it takes to flood Blue Heron anymore. We almost have to have a flood to get that data point, so we'll know. We're not hoping for that, but we don't know.
Have the barometric pressures, have they been going lower than they used to?
I wouldn't say that the pressures are getting lower, but a lot of these low pressures are associated with these extratropical cyclones, and they say, what I've read is the frequency of those is not really going up, but the intensity might be going up. So you could see greater lows. But here's the barometric pressure that day, 29.22. So, I mean, this is just, and the winds were northwest, not all that strong, fortunately, but 12-mile-an-hour northwest, creates some waves down here. But this is just another, if we see another combination of a 29.22 barometer with a 9.7 predicted tide, we're probably going to put out an alert that there's, we think there's a good chance that there could be some flooding, or we'll get a high enough tide to produce flooding. Yeah.
Is the low barometric pressure in that last day you showed, the barometric pressure was lower earlier in the morning, and so if the barometric pressure was lower 4 or 5 or 6 hours before the high tide, that could be. Is it an instantaneous thing, or is a low pressure hours before
it probably is not instantaneous. It's kind of like the harmonic constituents in this moon and sun. It lags behind. It's very logical that it would lag behind a little bit. So that low pressure earlier very well could have had an impact. But these low pressure was lower earlier, but we're just so unlucky sometimes that these low barometric pressure just correspond in time exactly with the tide. It'd be so much nicer if the low barometric pressure was in the middle of the night when the tides are super low, but it seems like they always nail us. So back up. Determining actual, and I said why it's important to know what the actual water level is, because we need to know how much impact there was of these meteorological constituents, and we also need to know what it takes to cause flooding. And we use the NOAA graphs primarily to give us to tell us what the actual water levels were or at any point in time. But there is another way on Samish Island. There it is. This is my tide gauge, and I have a benchmark, and tide stations have benchmarks. They measure the level of the actual level of the water relative to their benchmarks at some place on land, and mean low or low water is X number of feet below their benchmark. That's how they measure. Well, I have a benchmark. My benchmark is right up there at the top of that ecology block down on our beach. And I've done a lot of measurements, not quite 50, but I think more than 30, where I have put my laser level right there, and I have measured how far that point is above a whole bunch of high tides in the winter. And then I go on Port Townsend actuals to see what the water level actually was for that high tide. It's 9'5" or 8'5" on the book, but what was the actual water level? And then I measured down from my benchmark to where that water level was, and I've done that a bunch of times. And I've averaged those things out, and it turns out my benchmark right there is 12.5 feet above mean low or low water. And then one day I said, oh, that's okay, but what if our tidal range was actually bigger? I mean, it says our tidal range here is the same as Port Townsend. What if it was actually bigger? If it was actually bigger, then this point would be more than 12.5 feet above a 0-0 tide. So Gail and I went out there one day, and I didn't use my laser because it wouldn't shoot that far, but we used the builder's level and set it up really well. And we measured the height of the benchmark above a 0-0 tide. And it was very gratifying. It was 150 inches. I'm not kidding you. That benchmark was 150 inches above mean low or low water, or 0-0 tide that day. And the tide at Port Townsend that day, the 0-0 tide was right at the 0-0 mark. So that just sort of showed me that this tide gauge is pretty decent.
How did you set it in the first place?
Oh, I just put the wood part.
Yeah.
I just put that in last year. I've been measuring these tides for 5 years. So
Like making a mark on your ecology block.
I didn't make a mark, but I just measured down from my benchmark up here down to, it's 150 inches. So one day it was a 9-foot tide, 108 inches, and the actual tide was 9 foot. So that's 108 inches above mean low or low water. Well, that day, if I had my laser up there and I measured down to where the level of that tide, it was 42 inches, give or take. But you do enough of those and you average amount, and it came out to. So anyway.
Well, you set your laser level on the ecology block.
On the ecology.
And then you walk out with your yardstick.
Yeah, but it's right up next to it, because I'm only measuring on 7-foot, 8-foot tides or something like that. So I put a mark down there, I put my thing down, measure the height above that tide that day, add the tide and that difference, that gives you a number somewhere near 150, 152, 148, whatever, average them all out, 150. Yeah, so,
So about how far out is the water when it's at 0, 0?
how far out? It's about 100 feet out there. Yeah, so, I mean, that tide, beach slopes pretty well, but you go out there only about 100 feet, maybe a little bit more, and it's, that water level is 150 inches below the top of that ecology block. And then, of course, that's at 0, 0. It goes out, we have big tides, it goes out another 3 feet beyond that to a 3 foot minus, or the highest observed tide is 3'6" or,
Yeah, about that.
yeah. So anyway, 18th of December last year. These are not easy photographs to get. And I'm looking for really tall volunteers that would like to put their waders on and wade out there in front of this. And fortunately, the wind wasn't blowing too bad that morning, so I got a pretty darn good measurement. So right there, that's the 11'5", and so this tide on my tide gauge that morning, actual water level was just a little over 11 feet. That's what my tide gauge said. Well, here's NOAA's actual tide for that day, December 18th, 11.04. I'm right on the money. And there's also an assumption involved when we're using Port Townsend actuals. The assumption throughout the year is our tides are, the same as Port Townsend's. And if they have an actual tide, it's a predicted 9.5, but it comes in at 9.8. That's about what our tides are, 9.8. And day in and day out, I think that's a pretty good assumption. But on these storm tides, where there's anomalies and everything else, that's not a very good assumption. You read these papers. We're kind of in, and Carson can talk about this too, we're sort of in the bullseye in a way of these wind effects and the remote sea level anomalies. We can feel them because of the shallowness of the bay and the exposure to north winds and southeast winds and all that. Our storm surge is probably higher typically than what they experience at Port Townsend. So using Port Townsend actuals and saying, it was 12-foot tide in Port Townsend on the 27th. Our tide very easily could have been higher than that, and it was coming over. The waves were coming over the top of this. I mean, 12-foot tides right there. That was the actual on the 27th, but that water was coming over this strongly over this ecology block on the 27th. So anyway, that's another way. When we get flooding,
mitigating circumstances, you haven't mentioned rain flow, snow melt, river run.
Yeah.
And in both the 2022 floods, there was a tremendous amount of snow melt, and the rivers were all at flood stage. How does that affect it?
It does affect it. I don't think the articles we've looked at have characterized it very well, except to say it can influence it. The runoff, the fresh water coming in here can and does influence the water level also. It's not something that we have been taking into account when we're trying to make these wild ass guesses on what the storm surge is going to be, but we probably should be taking account. If the Samish is really, really high, it can, on the north side of the island anyway, it can add to the the storm surge. An interesting side note, really, and I don't remember the dates, but it was right after that bomb cyclone that we had November? What's that?
21st.
November 21st, this bomb cyclone went up alongside the coast. Really, really strong south winds along the coast, and probably this Ekman transport that Carson talked about was pushing water. Whew, that's what they did on the ship a lot.
Maybe Carson was.
Yeah, you want to chime in on that one? Anyway, and he's going to get a chance here in a second, but I just, we saw some tides. We saw high tides while this was all going on, and we had some pretty low barometers, and we had some winds, and we were anticipating some storm surge or whatever. But after that was all over, it might have been the 24th or the 25th, we had a 29.2, literally a 29.92 barometer. That's standard pressure. That's not a low barometer. That's just an average standard pressure. We had 0 winds. And the tide was a foot higher than predicted. And we're actually in communication with the authors of these articles, and we went out to them and said, what was that all about? You know, we got this weird tide. What was that all about? They came back. One of the guys said, naturally, guess what? Remote sea level anomaly. But the other guy said maybe the fresh water coming into the bay might have contributed to that. That's what they thought. But my personal opinion was that Ekman transport that was going on and pushing all that extra water into the sound as that cyclone moved up the coast, it just takes a while for that water to get back out again. So we start having tides, but they're starting at a higher level because all that extra water is pushed in, and it takes a few cycles for it to get out. All right, let's get to the bottom line here. Here's the chart. These are the king tides we're going to have this winter. Starting on the 7th, 3 9-foot-5 tides. Then in the middle of December, we're going to have a couple of 9-foot-9 tides. We're going to have another 9 in January. So we got some tides in front of us here to be concerned about. And I think that's the end of the slideshow. So, any questions about stuff that occurred to you while we were talking about all this? Yes?
Yes, almost in this age of supercomputers, nobody's talking about AI and doing predictions using the meteorological data and putting it into computers and having AI.
I haven't seen any reference to that.
Nothing in meteorological data.
Yeah.
Using AI. All other aspects of human life, and AI is around. But
Yeah.
we're not talking about it with this kind of data.
What's that? Okay. Talking about the roles of supercomputer and artificial intelligence in this whole business of projecting tides and predicting storm surges. I'm sure it's happening. They're working on it. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of work going on at NOAA, to the extent they're still funded, on this very question to try to get better at predicting storm surges. And what role artificial intelligence will play in that. I mean, when you're talking about trying to put together a huge amount of data and making sense out of it, yeah. Okay. I'm going to escape this. Okay. Now we're gonna. Do you want to?
Sure. Yeah. All right, so I'm going to talk about some of the tools that we can use to kind of predict when storm surge may become an issue. The biggest tool that Bill and I use on a regular basis, even just to check what the tides are doing for when we're going out to work, is this website. It's called windy.com.
Yo. Oh,
It's all right.
well, why don't you move over here?
Okay. So, Windy has a bunch of different layers that we can use to look at what's going on with wind, pressure, waves, which are the main ones that we're looking at. And right now we have pulled up this Friday on the 7th, which is our first king tide of the year. And we can see here that the wind is a west-northwest wind that is pushing water into the strait, which will raise water levels here. But we're also not very concerned about this because when we pull up our pressure layer, it shows down here, you can see when it's red, this is our higher pressure system. So because it's high pressure, even though the wind is being pushed, the wind and water are being pushed into the sound, this high pressure will mitigate that. So we won't have to worry about having a flood event on the 7th. And so we can use that in a bunch of different ways because we can also use, zoom in here on Samish Island with our wind. And we can see that even though the wind it's not even going to be that strong, it looks like it's going to be about 10 to 15 knots here pushing water into the sound. But even here at Samish Island, we're looking at a southerly wind that isn't as strong. So we're both not having the wind effect pushing the water into the bay, and we're also not having the pressure line up. So we're looking at all those combinations. And we also are tracking the river flow. We track that every day we go out when we're harvesting anyways, because when the flow hits a certain point, the bay will shut down to harvesting. So we're looking at that, and that's also a consideration when we're looking at the storm surge, is we're looking at having multiple of those factors line up that would cause a catastrophic flooding event here on Samish Island. And that's really the main thing that we're looking at is this app, tracking the winds locally and in the strait as well as offshore. And then also the pressure and the river flow. Those three things are really the things that we have, when they line up correctly, can cause a flood event. Beyond that, we were talking about that 18.6 year cycle. So we are in the middle of that. And that is also when you're asking about the pressure being higher now, while it's not necessarily higher right now, we're at a point in the cycle or around it where we're having more of these king tides every single year. So we're having a higher chance for all of these factors to line up. And so that's why we're seeing these flood events happen more often, is because we're looking at that and we're seeing, okay, we have all these chances for the barometric pressure and the wind and the rain flow to all add up into this effect of storm surge.
That's actually good news.
So is that going to close that so we can open that other barometric pressure?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, let's go out of there. And then,
Yes.
Have you by any chance checked the accuracy about, like that's the way Steve checked the tides with what Cooktown really gets? Is Windy pretty accurate?
Windy is pretty accurate, yes. That's what we use on an everyday basis when we're looking at the wind, because it affects us in multiple ways beyond storm surge. We're also looking at it because a west-northwest wind will affect whether we can load our boat on a given day to go out on the tide, because when it gets really choppy out there, it becomes very difficult to load all of our equipment. And then beyond that, when we're going out, we're looking for those west-northwest winds because that causes a lot of chop out in the deeper parts of the bay and the channels. So when we're going out, and especially when we're hauling a tractor or heavy equipment out there, we're looking at that to make sure that we're able to transport all of our gear and personnel out there safely.
let's go to the 168 hours up here on the prediction. So this is another tool that we use. This is a barometric pressure predicting app, and this one's on the Samish Island Community Center webpage. I think you'll find a link to that. So we're looking at that a lot, and looking for those barometric pressures down under 29.5, and we actually see one there that's getting pretty close to 29.4. But that is at That's on the 5th, so that is not a particularly high tide right then, but it's a pretty low barometer. So the tide, we anticipate that the tide on the 5th will be a little bit higher than predicted, but not high enough to get us into that 11-foot 4.4 range. So there's not going to be any alert. And then as we go out further, it actually is going up, so there's really nothing of any concern in this first run of tides on the 7th, 8th, and 9th that make us think that we're going to have any flooding. Then we'll go up here. You see that mag one right there?
Mm-hmm.
This guy. This is a NOAA website that we've just, one of the authors of Ian Miller, one of the authors of this article, put us onto this one. And AI might be involved in this because they're actually modeling or trying to project 7 days forward on what the storm surge is going to be. And you got to kind of have to get used to using this thing because the times are in UTC or Greenwich Mean Time, so we're at -8, so you have to add 8 hours to when the tide is. But if we went out there, we've run it, and it doesn't show anything of any concern through that entire run of tides. That would be, I think, at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, 1500 UTC on the 7th would be one of them, and there isn't anything. There, is that what you're on right now?
Yep.
Yeah. That green is just essentially right on the no storm surge, or a half a foot or something like that. So this is one that we're just using and we're trying to get comfortable with it and getting a sense of how accurate that actually is. And of course, we also assume that when you look out 7 days, it's going to maybe not be quite so accurate, but as you get closer, this thing's probably going to get more accurate. So it's one we can use. And then you see that ETSS, this one right here? We'll refresh it. This is a good one. Although it only looks out 3 days, so we can't see on this one right now, we can't see the 7th, but we do see that. We saw that low, that 29.4 barometer on the 5th, I guess it was. And you put a cursor on that to show the delta up there, way at the top.
This too, yeah.
They're predicting that's what the tide's actually going to come in on. And these, I don't know why they don't use mean low or low water. They use some other tide datum on this, although everything else that they do is mean low or low water, but there's something else. But it's a 10-foot tide. So on the book it's 9'1", and they're projecting that tide will be about a 10-foot tide on the 5th. So nothing for us to really worry about. It's not going to be 11'4", but there is going to be a higher than predicted tide or two during that period. So we're looking at this as we get within the 3 days of a high tide. We're really paying attention to this one to see what they're predicting for high. And this is down here. You can see these are Port Townsend tide. They also have Cherry Point, Friday Harbor, but like we've covered here thoroughly tonight, we use Port Townsend. That's our reference station here.
Steve, what level are you putting out alerts for? That's one.
Well, that magic 11'4" number is if we're thinking it might come in, at that point, we'll put out an alert. But we're pretty conservative, so we see a pretty low barometer and a high predicted tide, and the winds are of concern, and we put our finger on those anomalies, then we put out an alert. We don't want to miss one, and we have put out a lot of alerts, and we haven't had flooding. But again, we don't know what it's going to what it's going to take to cause this flooding. But that's the methodology that we're using, and a little bit of history of or information about what creates the tides around here.
Steve, do we know what the top of the dike elevation is now?
The top of the dike, is Norton here by any chance? No.
What's that?
The Port District dikes, Norton says they're around 13 feet, right? Or 13 and a half. 12 and a half?
12.45.
Okay, 12.45? I thought
That's some of them, yeah.
okay, so that's not as high as I thought. And then the ecology blocks in the spots where they've been put on the land trust / Petaluma Bay property, they're around 13 feet, aren't they? That's based on my
Depends
measurement.
on Port Townsend, using Port Townsend.
Yeah,
11 foot comes into the bottom of the ecology.
yeah, and they're about 2 feet tall.
They should be at maximum 12.45 because going any higher than that was not allowed.
Ah, okay, then that's definitely
That's where they are.
that's where they are. If anybody asks you, they're at 12.45.
Oh, I saw them tamping
Yeah.
down.
Any other questions? Yes.
Do we know how big waves get on Alice Bay? Because we have to have waves, in terms of overtopping the dike, we have to think about the waves.
Yeah.
So we can also use Windy to look at that. Within Windy, it seems like typically the waves are only going to get up to about 2 feet from what I've seen. But within here we have some more layers. There's a waves layer, but that one, I don't think that one tends to be as accurate as using the swell layer. And once we put on swell, it will actually show you how big the waves are in any given area. When you use, even if you zoom in, especially. Of course, like right now for the 7th, most of these days it's going to show you 0 feet because we don't typically have waves. But if we do have a day where there's bigger waves, which is probably not even within this whole thing. But theoretically, if there were, you could go in here and put in swell, and you can see exactly how high those waves are. And within swell, you're typically looking at actually about half of that height, or a little bit more than half, because the way that swell is measured from the trough to the wave crest is that won't actually, it won't be that full height that will actually be higher than the tide. You're actually only looking at about 50 to 60% of that total wave height.
We have had some pretty strong winds, not lately, but we have in the past
Mhm.
had some hurricane level, low level, pretty intense waves.
Mhm.
I'd say more than 2 feet.
Yeah. But on average, that's what I mostly am seeing is about 2 feet on a given normal
Sure.
windy day.
Right.
But that, of course, that's what we've been kind of lucky in a way. We
Right.
looked at those 2 flooding events, and the winds were not that strong. The glass was way down, but the winds weren't all that ferocious. If they had been, and they can be, it would have been a lot worse. Could have been a lot worse. Is that a wrap? I think it is.